Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle and this is my 80th video discussing British science fiction. In this video I thought I might have a little fun taking a deep dive with a single John Russell Fearn Vargo Statten novel that has just been reprinted for the 10th time, The Catalyst. We see this 10th reprinting here. L'oro vien dal cielo, the gold comes from the sky. That's the Italian title of The Catalyst. And this is another beautiful Italian edition published by Profondo Rosso in Italy, the imprint of the famous Italian film director and writer Luigi Cozzi. Luigi has been publishing a whole line, you see them there, a whole line of vintage SF novels that were first translated and celebrated in Italy in the 1950s, including several by Fearn and the others by E.C. Tubb. However, many of these Italian reprints were translations made from French editions rather than the original English, so Luigi himself has been making new and more accurate translations from the English editions, which are provided for him. And now The Catalyst has been retranslated and reprinted in Italy by Luigi, who had been one of that country's youthful admirers of the 1955 edition. I was pleased to provide an afterword for the book, it says there, and that afterword actually forms the basis for this video. Now then, on the next row there, we see The English Sky in 1951 first edition of The Catalyst, with a nice Ron Turner cover. Quintessential science fiction. What would happen if? Fearn devised a single striking SF premise and then let his imagination explore its possible ramifications. The type of novel he himself most enjoyed writing, infused with what even these most fierce critics have recognised as a fervid excitement. The titular catalyst is a chunk of rock, a cinder from the sun-blasted planet of Mercury. And it's brought to Earth along with a large cache of diamonds by space explorer Scott Andrews and his wife Nancy, the first people to set foot on the planet nearest the sun. But before the Mercutian cinder can be examined by Earth scientists, it's stolen by thieves, inadvertently taken along with the cache of Mercutian diamonds, which had been the thieves' real target. The consequences of this action are astounding, resulting in horrifying deaths and escalating dangers on Earth that eventually causes cosmic chaos across the entire solar system. Fearn's plot cleverly retold the story of King Midas in science fictional terms, most notably the fate of his daughter, where in Fearn's novel an innocent young girl is dramatically killed, transmuted into a gold statue. The basis of this classic flight of imagination is an audacious one. Quote, a catalyst which can change a man to gold, not necessarily a man, but water. And its rationale, Mercury, a world orbiting close to the sun, that's so scorched that there's no water. A catalyst, quote, is the unknown factor in chemical analysis. It does certain things, but we don't know why. It just does. For instance, hydrogen and oxygen, if heated, will not ignite if they're perfectly dry. But add one drop of water, the catalyst, and there's a tremendous explosion. Extrapolation. A catalyst can exist, especially if it be formed from a world, Mercury, which has no vestige of water vapour, which can have a very strange effect on water when brought into contact with it. It's not inconceivable that its inherent action might alter the atomic setup of any object near it, particularly water, because that is the substance, or rather liquid, for which it has the least affinity. And the fate of the thief in Fearn's novel, in running away with the diamonds, must have got himself overheated, Probably he perspired, and in his pocket was that piece of rock, water. I believe catalytic reaction took place and it seized upon the moisture. The effect was progressive. Since human beings are 3 parts water anyway, the effect was most thorough, and our hapless friend was transmuted into gold. And how? Since this rock has come from a totally dry world, it will have built up a catalytic action towards moisture. The surprising thing is that it turns water or liquid into gold. Large diamond fields on the surface of Mercury, along with the catalyst rock, form a central part of the plot of the catalyst. When I first read this novel in the 1950s, I thought the idea of lots of diamonds on Mercury was just a flight of fancy. But astonishingly, modern-day scientists are now speculating that Mercury's surface may well be studded with diamonds. They believe that meteorites may have turned much of that planet's graphite crust into precious gemstones. Diamonds may actually litter the surface of the planet. Those diamonds would have been forged by space rocks pummeling Mercury for billions of years. The planet's long history of being pelted by meteorites, comets, and asteroids is clear from its cratered crust. And now computer models are suggesting that these impacts may have had another effect. Meteorite strikes may have baked about 1/3 of Mercury's crust into diamonds. Planetary scientist Kevin Cannon shared that finding on March the 10th, 2022. Cannon works at the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, US. He presented his results at the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference in the Woodlands, Texas. Now, diamonds are crystal lattices of carbon atoms. Those atoms lock together under extreme heat and pressure. On Earth, diamonds crystallize at least 93 miles underground. The gemstones then ride to the surface during volcanic eruptions. But meteorite strikes are also thought to form diamonds. Those impacts create very high heat and pressure that can transform carbon into diamonds, Cannon explains. With that in mind, he turned to Mercury's surface. Surveys of that surface suggest it contains fragments of graphite, a mineral made of carbon. What we think happened is that when Mercury first formed, it had a magma ocean, Cannon says. Graphite crystallized out of that magma. Meteorites slamming into Mercury's crust could have later turned that graphite into diamond. Cannon wondered just how much diamond might have been forged in this way. To find out, he used computers to model 4.5 billion years of impacts on a graphite crust. If Mercury were coated in graphite, 300 meters, that's 984 feet thick, the battering would have made 16 quadrillion tons of diamonds. That's 16 followed by 15 zeros. Such a trove would be about 16 times Earth's estimated stockpile. Simone Marshy is a planetary scientist who wasn't involved in that research. He works at the Southwest Research Institute in Boulder, Colorado. And he says there's no reason to doubt that diamonds could be produced in this way. But how many diamonds might have survived is another story. Some of the gemstones were likely destroyed by later impacts, he says. Cannon agrees, but he thinks the losses would have been very limited. That's because the melting point of diamond is so high, it exceeds 4,000 degrees Celsius, it's over 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Future computer models will include diamonds remelting, Cannon says, and that could refine the estimated size of Mercury's current diamond supply. Now, Europe and Japan's Bepi Colombo space mission is presently underway, and the 2 probes will be reaching Mercury in November this year. One orbiting probe could search for infrared light reflected by diamonds, Cannon says, and this could reveal how glitzy the solar system's smallest planet really is, and just how prescient Fern's imagination was. Like many Vargo Statten novels, the Catalyst core idea had been completely changed and reworked from one of Fern's earlier American pulp stories. The Man Who Bought Mars is by Bolton Cross in the June 1941 issue of Fantastic Adventures. See the story here. There it is. The Man Who Bought Mars is by Bolton Cross. And if we turn to the climax of the story, final chapter, you see there the fate of the villain. And Fern later had that story reprinted in his own magazine, the British Space Fiction magazine, and that story was reprinted here, but this time it was called Mars for Sale, and as by Douglas Dodd, Fern's pseudonym. So you can find this story in that magazine. Now there, next we see here the Catalyst in its French edition. The Catalyst was first reprinted in France in 1954 in the Fleuve Noir series, Anticipation. And then in 1955, it was translated into Italian by Mondadori in their Urania, famous Urania series. Now the French edition was also translated into Portuguese for a Brazilian edition published by Technoprint in Rio de Janeiro, a mass-market publisher that launched several science fiction collections such as Futuramica, Fantastic, and Ficcio science fiction. And first printed in the late 1950s, it became a bestseller, and so it was reprinted at least 3 times into the 1970s. Now, French editors found the Catalyst so intriguing that it was selected to be republished as a graphic novel by Reddit in their celebrated Siderel series of comic books in 1976, along with many other Fern French anticipation novels. Just have a flick through this book here. You can see it's of an excellent standard illustration, exciting space adventures on Mercury and in space, and then the various intrigues when the cinder's brought to Earth. And there's the thief being turned into a gold statue, which we mentioned. Excellent. Now, this last book we see there is an Italian omnibus edition. And when reprinting the Catalyst and other translated Vargo Statten novels in an omnibus edition in 1979, you'll see the range of novels that were reprinted in 1979. There we see them. They're all the novels, including the Catalyst. There's the Catalyst, the gold comes from the sky. And then there was commentary on each of the novels by Hugo Malaguti, the publisher. He wrote extensive essays about them. Lovely book, that one. Now, the Italian publisher wrote of the author in that book. John Russell Fearn, aka Vargo Statten, who everyone thought was French in the 1950s, including some well-known experts at the time, because the published translations of the Urania novels were based on the French versions published by Fleuve Noir. Now, this is Malaguti talking. Since I studied French even before English, I always loved this language, which was the language of the singer-songwriters I loved dearly as a child. And in France, there were so many science fiction publications featuring characters that I'd already met in the Urania translations. When I wanted to study this language a little more, I found no better way than to request many books from Fleuve Noir. At the time, I was 10 or 11 years old. I was starting to read the first Urania novels, and I saw nothing better than reading more with the excuse of learning a different language. Let's remember that back then, reading science fiction, if not considered defamatory, was considered a waste of time, something counterproductive. So, with the excuse of studying French, which was very much appreciated by my family and my teacher at the time, I read tons of science fiction books, and all this without having to hide it, without being told I was wasting time on useless little books. This happened to all of us back then. My peers who then read comics or detective novels or Urania, how times have changed, right? So I learned that Vargo Statten wasn't French but English. The same discovery that in those years other very young people of the time made, like Luigi Cozzi, who went to collect old issues of Fleuve Noir at the fabulous bookstalls of Milan. I went to the Zanichelli bookshops, ordered those books along, I think, with the French edition of Le Journal de Mickey Mouse, yes, in French, and read them. I understood maybe half of it because the words escaped me, and I anxiously awaited the translations of Urania, which perhaps never arrived. Vargo Statten, hugely popular in England and France, was a true idol in our country. Gold Comes from the Sky, in particular, remained a legendary memory for years. I believe it was the most successful Urania novel ever. Even the legendary Lascia o Raddoppia was included with the video among the questions about the book asked of a contestant who presented himself on science fiction back then in the 1950s, and it was an indisputable sign of popularity. Lascia o Raddoppia, Leave It or Double It, was the most popular TV game show ever in Italy, the Italian version of the American $64,000 question. And as Malaguti revealed, the catalyst was celebrated on Italian national television when its plot was the subject of this leading quiz show. Finally, I should like to share with you another unique sidelight on the chat list. The first edition, published by Sky in 1951, like most newspapers and paperbacks, was printed using what was known as hot metal typesetting in letterpress printing using molds. Each line of the type was cast with the spaces between words achieved by the use of space bands, using blank matrices of different sizes to justify lines and create the proper amount of white space. Now, on the spines of the Vargo Statten novels, you see the spine there, on the spines one can see that they set out the author name Vargo Statten at the top and the publisher Sky Unlimited at the bottom. The title of the novel was printed in the middle. The title was printed in the middle, with a set space on either side. However, as I came across multiple copies over the years, I noticed that something had gone wrong with this particular title. As the print run got underway, the vibrations of the printing press seemed to have slowly dislodged the space bands, with the result that the spinal lettering was printed with varying spaces on a distinct slant. There's this other copy. Now you can see that the sig slant there, the variant edition. I've seen this effect occasionally on just a handful of the hundreds of books printed by the mushroom publishers, and with usually only a very slight shift. But with the Catalyst we have a clear inch or so shift of the author and publisher. All of which makes this a very special book to mad completists like myself. Let me know in your letters what variants you have.